Chapter 1 Crash and Burn. The BB-18 was the third most popular street race in El Flete, Texas, and by no means the most difficult. Starting on the Nueces Bay Bridge, the race opened with a straight 12-kilometer dash north toward the Comerica district. From there, the route jackknifed into a series of tight urban turns for the last third, before sliding to a finish in the city spillway. A pleasantly mixed bag inviting new racers to cut their teeth, and therein laid the BB-18's appeal. Every race, some newbie bit off more than they could chew. The race on the evening of April 18, 2070 was only marginally different. From the outset, the two most experienced racers had locked down first and second, and the crowd's savage attention had rapidly shifted to the three-way fight for third. The favorite of the three was an aggressive newcomer in a four-door sedan with chipping paint and one broken tail light. Beside him, two racers in a refurbished hatchback were digging into the sedan's driver's side door. Finally, behind both of them was a narrow, sporty motorcycle, looking for an opening that wouldn't get them pinched between the cars. On the straightaway, the hatchback and bike had pressed their advantage for speed. Then the race turned into the winding urban decay, and the big block sedan started to make up the difference. It plowed through mounds of garbage, cut around corners and up curbs, making shortcuts and taking punishment the other two couldn't match. Finally, it had forced its way past the motorcycle and started gunning for the hatchback. But the hatchback wouldn't be so easily threatened. As the driver of the hatchback pushed the little car even harder, his passenger took a machine pistol out of the glove box. He leant out the window and leveled it at the sedan. Pulling a gun during a race was grounds to get disqualified, but these two were desperate for an edge. Out the corner of his helmet, the driver of the sedan saw the threat and hurriedly tapped the brakes. Half a dozen bullets shattered windows and ricocheted off the hood as the sedan jolted back. At the same time he lost speed, the driver whipped the wheel to one side. The four doors front bumper slammed into the hatchback's rear wheel well. The hatchback was sent into a series of perilous swerves as the driver fought to keep under control. He lost speed, kept a tight grip on the wheel, and gradually wrestled the little vehicle under control. But he was unaware of the sedan taking position behind him. The driver of the sedan took aim, gripped the wheel with nervous excitement, then stepped hard on the gas. The four-door let out a pained roar as it accelerated, then the two vehicles met with a deafening crunch. The sedan's front bumper dug deep into the hatchback's rear end. The little car shook like a bomb had gone off, and the loss of control was palpable. Panicked, the driver tried to force his car into control, but this time there was nothing he could do. Gears in the hatchback's differential were twisted in the crash, locking out the rear wheels. Even as the engine screeched and fought, the hatchback was braking hard. It drifted left to the curb and crashed out against a light pole. The driver of the sedan cheered and raised his fist as he watched the crash in the rear view, but his success was short-lived. Though the damage to his own car was largely cosmetic, he'd been too focused on the fight to prepare for the coming turn. By the time the driver of the sedan turned his eyes back to the road, it was already too late. He twisted the wheel, pulled the e-brake, prayed to a god he didn't believe in, but there was no stopping the inevitable. The car drifted to one side, bounced up the curb, and slammed its full broadside against the concrete wall of a construction site. The sedan's remaining windows shattered in a single burst. A sturdy helmet and a sturdier skull saved the driver from a nasty concussion, but not the whiplash. Stars and fireworks danced in his eyes, but through the blur he could still see clear enough to watch the motorcyclist slip into third place. 2 miles up the road at the finish line, the crowd cheered with bloodthirsty glee, watching on huge live feed screens provided by drones following the race. The cheers were still deafening as first, second, and third came blazing in. The celebrations didn't wait for the others to finish. As the fourth and fifth drivers came limping in, the awards had already gone out to the victors. Sixth place arrived just as the last of the refreshments were being scooped up. Yet the driver of the sedan never appeared. In the elated mess of the after-party, no one ever thought to ask what became of the other drivers. As the race after-party set into full swing, a lone EFPD patrol car arrived at the scene of the crash. There were always easy busts to be made in the aftermath of a big blowout, and tonight was no different. The two men from the hatchback, one dead against the steering wheel and the other throwing up in the gutter, were picked up and sent to the morgue and a jail cell respectively. The cops advanced on the broken remains of the stolen sedan, but there was no one inside. No blood, no torn clothes, no evidence there had been any driver at all. Near half a kilometer away, almost on the other side of the district, the driver of the sedan was trying to drunkenly run off his whiplash. He could only manage a few quick steps before he would brace himself against a wall and force himself not to throw up inside his helmet. Yet despite all his stops and starts, the dazed racer made it to his destination. Parked out of sight, but still conspicuously out of place, was an onyx black Cryer Trajan, a full-size luxury car complete with smoked windows and chrome framework. It was by definition a four-door sedan, though its long, wide body and flat, square grille seemed more reminiscent of an SUV. From the outside it was protected like an armored truck, but inside was plush and comfortable brown leather. The driver from the race opened the rear door of the Trajan and splattered himself across the back seat. In the driver's seat of the Trajan was a Caucasian man in the middle of his 70s. There wasn't a single hair on his head besides his eyebrows, and his squat face was saggy but unblemished. Though his left eye was a natural dark green, the right was matte, slightly oversized, and with a faded brown sclera. He wore a black suit so crisply tailored it might have been weaved out of steel. As his charge splayed across the back seat, the bald man turned in his seat and rested one massive arm over the car's partition. His voice was deep, unmelodious, and slightly sarcastic. "Was it everything you hoped?" The former driver of the dead four-door finally sat up in his seat and struggled to pull off his helmet. Out from beneath the intimidating black racing helmet came a round and clean-shaven boyish face framed by satellite dish ears. He had the short, shaggy brown hair of a bohemian, along with thick eyebrows and a slightly sullen mouth that made him look a little sad. It was the same with his brown eyes, but with the downturned understanding of a big lazy dog. One that lays still and dejected, but springs to life whenever someone moves towards the door. In the right environment, the eyes could be keenly expressive, and tonight they almost beamed out of the skull. And just a little bit more. The next morning, Franklin Blanchard's neck felt like a piece of rubber that had all the elastic stretched out of it. Even on top of 3 pillows, the negligible weight of his head was causing him to ache. He tossed and turned in discomfort, but absolutely refused to get up. If Franklin had his way, he would have spent the entire day pretending he was dead, laying motionless as a corpse while the day slid past him. But the morning routine had to be followed. At 7:30 a.m. and not a second later, the automated system sprang to life with simulated merriness. The drapes snapped open on their wheeled tracks, the holographic clock grew in brightness and saturation, and a feminine voice with faux maternity piped in through hidden speakers. "Good morning, Franklin. The time is currently 7:30 a.m. and it's a beautiful 28 degrees Celsius outside. Thunderstorms are predicted late in the day. Be sure to bring an umbrella." When several minutes passed in motionless silence, the voice returned. "System has not detected any movement since your wake-up call. Are you okay, Franklin? Should I alert medical care?" "No." Franklin sat up in bed, nearly breaking his neck in the process. No medics. I'm fine, thank you." When another few minutes passed and the system didn't issue a follow-up, Franklin breathed a sigh of relief. If the program called in the medical responders, that would be his morning. An hour insisting he was alright, another hour of checkups to confirm that he was alright, and a final hour of legal boilerplate in the unlikely event he wasn't really alright. The hassle wasn't worth it. Better to shun his discomfort to one side and start the day. Even after half an hour in a hot shower and a few minutes of casual massage, Franklin's neck was still bothering him. Finally, he abandoned the natural solutions and turned to the artificial. The cerebellum implant connected to the base of Franklin's brainstem, which looked for all the world like a little metal centipede embedded in the back of his neck, silently blinked to life. The implant was capable of any number of things relating to signals delivered to the brain. In this case, the implant blocked the pain signals emanating from his neck, and the pain perceptibly disappeared. Franklin let out a sigh of relief, then he left the bathroom to go get dressed. The walk-in closet was filled with 50 clones of the same outfit: black slacks, bleached shirt, and black Eastern-style fold-over jacket. He examined his appearance in the full-length dress mirror laid into the wall. It wasn't all bad. The angular cut of his jacket put a statuesque twist on his broad shoulders, but whoever designed the slacks never accounted for the men with acutely hairy legs. Every step felt like he was generating enough static electricity to light up the city center. As he bent down to adjust his pant leg for the 8th time, Franklin pressed his thumb against the mirror and the projection began to change. Silently, the surface lost its reflection, and the shadow of where the mirror had been began to shrink, then widened until the aspect ratio was appropriate for a television. Fiddling with his socks, Franklin watched the morning news with studious attention. Last night, a routine inspection at the city border stopped a truck smuggling no less than 15 illegals, said a clean-cut news reporter. According to the EFPD's Sergeant James Royce, thermal imaging of the truck's cargo revealed men and women hiding inside mattresses, couches, and other furnishings. The story continued blandly from there, and the next one was a human interest piece about a dog that could whistle. Franklin considered waiting to watch the tertiary stories to see if last night's race would be reported, but even that was a long shot. Better to begin the day in earnest. West Oak was, conspicuously, the richest district in El Flete. Unlike the urban blight of Comerica or Coast View, where families lived literally on top of one another, in West Oak a single man may have full acres of garden land devoted to him. The district sat on a man-made plateau, literally overlooking the rest of the city, and under the crisp Texas sun the mansions in West Oak had an almost ethereal quality. The Blanchard estate was no different. Inside the high concrete walls and solid gates were spacious swaths of green grass, and healthy mountain laurels lined the long driveway. At the very back of the estate, slightly hanging over the cliff face, was the mansion. Ultra-modern and neo-elite in its design, with angular stylings and huge sweeping windows to make an indoor-outdoor space. The building had 3 floors, 9 bedrooms with bathrooms, a connected 8-car garage, and a full basement partially exposed by the cliff. All available to a family of 4. Franklin Blanchard left his suite on the 2nd floor in time to catch the morning sun between the distant skyscrapers. It certainly had the look of a beautiful day, even if it didn't have the feel of one. But every man had to pay for his mistakes, and Franklin accepted that he was no different in that regard. Descending the steps to the 1st floor, Franklin strolled into the secondary dining room, conjoined with the living room and tucked in the corner of 2 huge windows. There was only one person sitting at the table, a woman, willowy and elegant, with iron straight blonde hair that fell to the middle of her back. Physically, she looked no older than 25, with a young woman's smooth face, delicate hands, and untroubled eyes. But her body language betrayed her true age, poised and controlled with none of a young person's eagerness or drive. Her dress betrayed her too, conservative and so, with substance over style. She seemed eminently serious, thoughtful as she looked out the windows, but beamed from ear to ear when she spotted Franklin. "There you are." Amelia Blanchard quickly rose to her feet and embraced her son. "And how's my favorite young man doing this morning?" Franklin returned the embrace with genuine affection. "I can't complain. Or maybe I could, but choose not to." Amelia laughed as she returned to her seat at the head of the table. She was already on to the next subject. "How was the cake last night? Wasn't it just the best?" Franklin felt a cold sweat creep down his back. The BB-18 had begun just as the cake would have been served. Quickly and non-specifically he said, "Oh yeah, it was great." "Wasn't it though?" Her smile widened a bit. "Maybe I shouldn't pat myself on the back, but finding people that can source real flour is some kind of task, believe me. Their small talk continued on for several minutes until Junior appeared. Oliver Blanchard Jr. was a robust, healthy man, barely a year or two away from 30. Like his brother, he was taller than average, with broad shoulders, a round face, and large, empathetic eyebrows over brown eyes. Unlike his brother, his hair was sharply barbered, same as his beard, styled into a respectable ducktail. Amelia noticed him first and rose to greet him with outstretched arms. "There's my son." "Hi, Mom." Junior was quick to embrace her, then clapped his little brother on the shoulder. "So, how's it feel to be 23, Frankie?" "Feels pretty much the same as being 22. "Well, give it time. You'll see." Junior pulled out a chair and took a seat beside Franklin. "Sorry I couldn't make the party last night, but you know how the end of quarter can be." Franklin was willing to accept the apology right there, but Amelia cut in. "Apparently things are getting pretty hectic at the office. A lot of responsibility." "Oh, really?" Franklin asked, but already knew he wouldn't get an answer. From there on, the conversation was between Amelia and Junior, allowing Franklin to relax with his ready-made eggs on toast. Occasionally he'd dip back into the conversation, offering support here, a little sympathy there, but that was the most of it. As breakfast finished, Franklin handed his dishes to the service staff and readied himself for work. The Blanchards worked for the Odea Corporation, the single largest fuel company on the planet. After the last war, when the world's fuel reserves were drained almost empty, the three largest companies in the industry formed the Oil Distribution Alliance to maintain market dominance. Oil had been a misnomer even at the time, but the business structure had worked. Soon after, smaller companies had joined seeking shelter, so it was reorganized, strengthening its control. Alliance was changed to Associates, and Odea became the world's first megacorporation in 2053. Franklin J. Blanchard worked as a low-level executive in public relations for Odea. It paid next to nothing by executive standards, without any of the intrigue or appeal of supervising R&D, as Junior did, but it did have one major benefit. It was virtually impossible to be fired. In the 5 years he'd been working there, Franklin's team had only lost one member, a smug piece of work who'd knocked up a prostitute, then fallen off the face of the earth. Part of Franklin's suite on the second floor included a cerebral interface chair. Wires from the chair plugged directly into his implant, leaving his body limp as Franklin's consciousness linked directly to the Odea SCIS, short for Secure Cerebellum Interface Server. Instantly, Franklin landed in a virtual reconstruction of a corporate meeting room, huge table stretching out to his left and right. A large Odea logo, an oil black globe with chemical rainbows where the C's would be, hovered like a religious icon over the center of the table. In conjunction with Franklin, several other young executives from Alfesi, Tokyo, Dubai, and half a dozen other cities around the planet appeared at the table. They exchanged no pleasantries, made no small talk, just sat in empty silence until their boss appeared. A short, round man with small, round cyber eyes took position at the head of the table. "We'll start by reviewing our statistics on the American West Coast. We're showing strong numbers in..." The West Coast wasn't Franklin's region, not even close, so he tuned out the boss's remarks and turned his attention to other work. For a solid month he'd been shifting through regional alterations to company brands as part of a novelty campaign. It was a long way of saying he would be supervising Odea's new company slogan. 30 days of "Odea is fueling," with a variety of endings and a small selection of fonts. Most ended with "Our Planet," a few were simply "Humanity," but the ones that ended "the USA" couldn't be allowed, and Franklin had to strike them from the list. It took 20 minutes to make his way through another batch of taglines, and Franklin was done, though the meeting was far from over. So, Franklin did what he always did. A long time ago, an old friend from high school had taught Franklin how to leave a ghost of his physical projection, then sneak his consciousness off somewhere more stimulating. He knew it was a childish distraction tactic, but an effective one. Today, after leaving an impression of himself in the conference room, Franklin's consciousness moved to an old favorite. By 2070, the basic process for driver's education and examination had become a long and entirely simulated affair. Several hours in total immersion reality, then a brief exam, and anyone was ready to operate a motor vehicle. Then, some distant past and illicit computer whiz had put her hands on the program, tweaked the software so the parameters were far more forgiving and the virtual drivers were far less forgiving, and presto! A wholly safe and wholly illegal total immersion racing game, of which Franklin had a version loaded into his chair. From the conference room, Franklin slipped into the driver's seat of some ancient muscle car from the time of the program's creation, the kind with a massive engine and a clutch transmission. The program didn't wait for him to be ready. As soon as the world faded into existence, every car was in motion, including his own. Simulated physics pushed Franklin against his seat, nearly painting his eyeballs against the back of his skull. Gently biting his tongue between his teeth, Franklin gripped the wheel with both hands, swerving between two cars as he got in the rhythm. He pressed the clutch, slipped the vehicle into fifth, and there was another rush of speed. Sneaky drift around a curb, spin out another driver on a straightaway, and he'd passed two more cars. The program would load more cars in front of him infinitely, but there was an empty stretch as that program struggled to catch up with him. For that moment, there was no one ahead of him. Franklin relished that moment of being in the lead, until everything came to an abrupt halt. "Blanchard!" There was an alert from his impression back in the conference room. Immediately, Franklin suspended the program as his consciousness leapt back into the meeting. He did his best to keep the nerves out of his voice as he spoke. Yes, sir." There was a short but eerie silence as Franklin felt everyone's eyes boring into him. His boss broke the silence. "Give us your input on the Sheffield numbers." Sheffield? Franklin was drawing a blank on the location. Was that a city on the south coast? It would make sense for them to ask him about a southern coast city. That was where most of his statistics came from. He plumbed his mind for a location, but when none came, he was forced to wing it. "The Sheffield numbers are important, surely, but let's not lose sight of other USA cities. If we take a look at New Orleans, Tampa, and other cities along the Gulf, we are making a very strong showing. And if we add Sheffield into that mix..." Franklin was getting on a roll until the exec to his right cut in. She said, in her flat British accent, "Sheffield, UK, Franklin." Franklin's lips curled into a thin, high smile. "Of course it is. But we live in a global community, and what happens over here can have an effect." "Just quit while you're behind, Frank." The next several days passed in the same repetitive motions. Wake up, shower, dress, work. Wake up, shower, dress, work. Wake up, shower, dress, work. Until Franklin thought he was seeing ghostly versions of himself walking behind and in front of him. There was a slight reprieve on the fourth day as Franklin left the estate for a date. Like every executive in West Oak, Franklin Blanchard was provided with a bodyguard on behalf of his company, an old mercenary named Joseph Woods. Though he was average height, Joe's thick neck and massive rounded shoulders made him look a little shorter. Coupled with a jutting jaw and wide nose gave Joe a mastiff appearance. "Part the rainy clouds and let sun shine into my world." Franklin smiled and stretched out his arms. Something about Joe's squat, serious face and hairless scalp put Franklin in a mood to sing. Maybe on the chance that he could get the old merc to smile, which he did, rarely. "Part the rainy clouds and let sun shine into my world." Franklin smiled and stretched out his arms. Something about Joe's squat, serious face and hairless scalp put Franklin in a mood to sing. Maybe on the chance he could get the old merc to smile, which he did, rarely. "Good morning, Franklin." Joe held open the rear door of the Trajan as Franklin climbed inside and shut the door behind him. Behind the wheel, Joe started the engine and the big luxury car quietly crunched down the gravel driveway, out the gate, and onto the main road. "So, how is the morning treating you, Joe?" Joe met Franklin's eyes in the rearview mirror but didn't say anything. He didn't have to say anything. Joe had been Franklin's bodyguard long before Franklin worked for Odia. Now, almost after a decade and a half together, the two men could almost read each other's minds. Though Joe still had the advantage. Franklin's smile shrank a bit as he leant back in his seat. "Yeah, I am going to do it again. Or rather, we're gonna do it again. Another look in the rear view, but Joe remained silent. Oh, with your significant looks, Franklin laughed. Come on, speak freely. Joe sighed. What you're doing, it's an unnecessarily big risk. I'm aware, and I don't take my safety lightly, Franklin lied. I've taken your advice, installed all the safety cyberware a growing boy could ask for, and Franklin tapped his knuckles against his forehead to emphasize the point. That's not what I meant, Joe insisted. There are people, certain people, who are going to take notice of you and what you're doing. It was a valid point, and Franklin had to concede. You're right. When you're right, you're right. I know I need to be careful with other people. If it comes out where I come from in the wrong crowd, it could be incredibly dangerous. So I keep it controlled. That's not what Joe began, but cut himself off halfway. Just keep your head down and your chin up, huh? Franklin's smile widened. If left to his own whims, he would have loved to spend the rest of the day with Joe, learning lessons in slang from the old mercenary. But business had to be attended to, and it was simply business at the West Oak Cafe. Franklin had known the woman he was going to marry since he was 13 years old. It was at that age he'd been introduced to Anita Underwood, at the time also 13. The Underwoods were a solid legacy family in the Opolis Corporation, and Franklin was considered lucky to meet her. At the cafe, Anita had arrived early and locked down a table overlooking the city. Since their childhood, she'd grown into a proper young woman, and raring to go. Her jet black hair was styled into a rolled quiff on top of her head. A sharp nose and high cheekbones gave her an authoritarian edge accented by flat green eyes. She sat at the cafe table, legs appropriately crossed at the knee, wearing a brand-appropriate blue-green pantsuit that looked more like a uniform than business wear. The word bulletproof always crossed Franklin's mind when he saw her. Franklin. Anita smiled warmly as her face would allow. She rose from her seat, allowing Franklin to give her a quick kiss on the cheek before he settled in across on her. How was the drive? Franklin replayed the 5-minute drive in his head. Not bad. Little bumpy in places. Ah. Anita nodded like an executive. Like an Aero V in rough winds? No, more like loose shocks. There was a moment's silence before Franklin returned. What about you? How have you been? Anita gave a little half shrug. You know, busy at work, no time at home. End of the quarter hitting you hard? Kind of, not exactly, Anita politely corrected him. We've let go of a few folks, and I'm picking up the slack. Franklin wanted to press the topic further, maybe turn it into a conversation, but letting people go is never a good topic to pursue. For a while, the two of them just sat in what they thought of as companionable silence. The waiter came and they both ordered synth green leaf tea. Franklin sipped at his drink, and Anita at hers. City looks nice from up here. Yeah, beautiful. Franklin had intended to go back to the races for some time, but leaving the cafe in the late afternoon, he felt a need to put some action back in his life. On the drive home, he put a call into the fixture who'd got him into the last race. There were 2 more in the immediate future, one later that evening, one in a few days. The race in a few days still had openings, but the one later that evening already had their numbers. Franklin put in his attendance for both. With a little luck, maybe one of the racers wouldn't show up, or they'd get in a fight and be ejected from the race. Franklin wasn't lucky. Arriving appropriately early to the race, all the vehicles were already prepped on the starting line, and none of the drivers seemed poised to be forced out. Franklin felt demoralized, as if he'd been locked out of the party, and the time before the race was a party. In a city that glowed only one color after sunset, the race was another world. People drunk, high, or simply caught up in the mood bobbed around the area like underfilled balloons. Music of different types, from different corners of the globe, layered over one another to create a thumping war drum rhythm. And the smells, a mix between oil change shop and public locker rooms, somehow managed to mix together perfectly. Franklin decided he didn't have to leave right away. Instead, he surveyed the crowd and picked out a man of his approximate age and disposition sitting alone on a concrete barricade. The man had a shaved bald head and a paisley bandana tied over his mouth. Franklin approached him and leaned against the barricade. "What's happening, buddy?" The man said nothing, just stared back at Franklin with introverted eyes. Franklin tried again. "Putting any money on the race tonight?" The man got up and walked away. Not a fantastic first contact, but it could have gone worse. Franklin considered a different tact. On the other side of the pit, a few meters away from the starting line, a ramshackle bar had been set up with a steady crowd revolving in its orbit. Franklin wasn't a big drinker, or a drinker at all, but when in Comerica, do as the people do. Franklin pressed his way to the bar, blue, orange, green, and pink lights shining all around. He ordered a beer and was passed a bottle of Tipperov ale with the cap still on. Franklin expected to have a bottle opener passed to him with it, or have one handy, but there wasn't. Confused, he looked to the others in the crowd and saw a series of men and women resting the top of their closed bottles against the corner of the tabletop and smacking it open with the flat of their palms. If that was the way it was done, that was the way he'd do it too. Confident, Franklin rested his bottle cap against the counter, then hit it with a slap. The bottle stayed closed. Nerves crept up Franklin's back as he wondered if anyone saw. It didn't seem like anyone did, and he was free to make a second attempt. Again, he lined up the cap with the bar's edge and hit it square on the top. Again, the bottle stayed closed. Now he could feel his cheeks start to turn red. One more time, with gusto, Franklin rested the bottle cap against the corner of the bar, but just as he began to raise his hand, a voice interrupted him. "Do you need some help?" The voice was flat, a little husky, but unmistakably feminine. Franklin turned to one side and saw the woman standing shockingly close beside him. She was nearly as tall as him, with tan-brown skin, brown-black hair, and Franklin estimated her to be around his age. Some stupid, macho instinct deep in Franklin's gut told him to do it himself, but a better instinct squashed it down and he said, "Please?" The woman accepted the bottle in one metal hand. Franklin had seen cyber hands before, it'd be impossible to avoid them, but never one so unapologetic. The hands he'd seen had always made some attempt at humanity, with real skin or bright colors and always rounded fingertips. This woman's hand had flat-tipped fingers and brushed steel framework. Her thumb tucked neatly under the cap, and as if she were flipping a coin, popped the bottle open and passed it back. Any time. As she returned the bottle, Franklin took a moment to survey her, in the way a young man surveys a young woman. His eyes moved swiftly over her, not wanting to leer, but paused briefly on her thighs. Even beneath loose-fit leather pants, they seemed full and toned as an Olympian. Her torso was similarly athletic, with firm shoulders and a taut belly beneath modest, round breasts. She wore a button-up white shirt tucked into her pants, with shirt sleeves rolled to her upper arms. It was a contradiction of sorts, but her diamond-shaped face looked both mature and girlish at once. Smooth, pronounced cheekbones over sleek, serious lips. A slightly prominent nose sat between flat brown eyes and expressive eyebrows, and her brown-black hair was full, wolf-cut to just below her shoulders. Franklin took back his beer, desperate to think of something witty to say. When that didn't happen in time, he simply held out his hand, saying, Franklin? Franklin took back his beer, desperate to think of something witty to say. When that didn't happen in time, he simply held out his hand, saying, Franklin? He expected to wait a moment as she appraised him, much the same way he'd appraised her. Turnabout was fair play, but Franklin was a bit surprised when she accepted his hand without pause and replied, Bethany? Her words and voice were slightly humorous, though a smile never came close to her face. Franklin was encouraged, but before he could strike up a conversation, the start of the race was announced. On cue, Bethany made her excuses and left. Franklin abandoned his full beer on the bar and followed her, more than a little curious. For whatever reason, he felt an odd recognition of her that he couldn't quite put his finger on. The answer came when Bethany took to her vehicle on the starting line. It was the same motorcycle he'd raced against in the BB-18. You have been listening to an excerpt from But They Will Remain, narrated for you by the author. The full version, narrated by Roberto Scarlato, is now available on audible.com. Links on screen and in the description. Thank you all very much for listening.